Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out to this webinar. This is Alex from HR Simple. We're glad you're with us today. I'm going to give some people a few more minutes to log in to the website, so we will begin in 1 or 2 minutes. Thank you very much. I wrote a few comments in the chat box below. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to type them in there, and we will take a few minutes to answer them at the end. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out once again for this webinar hosted by HR Simple and presented by the attorneys at Gunster Law Firm. My name is Alex, and I am with HR Simple. We're glad you are here with us today. I'd like to welcome Ed Suarez and Holly Griffin from Gunster here to go over issues regarding sexual harassment in the workplace. Ed and Holly author the Florida Employment Law Manual along with other attorneys at Gunster, which you may purchase on hrsimple.com if you happen to live in the beautiful state of Florida. Today's presentation will last approximately 60 minutes. If you're here for SHRM or HRCI codes, you will get those on the next slide, so be sure to write those down. If you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat box, which is towards the bottom of your GoToWebinar control panel. We will try to get to all the questions at the end of the webinar. And finally, in a few days, we'll get this webinar, all the slides and audio up onto our YouTube account at youtube.com/HRSimple. Here are the codes for SHRM and HRCI. Feel free to write those down. You can also watch the YouTube video if you don't have time to write those down right now. If you have any questions after the presentation, feel free to email me. My email address is down at the bottom, alex@accr.biz. And once again, thank you for joining the webinar. Follow us on YouTube for this webinar and all the webinars we have had in the past. Questions can be sent to me, Alex at accr.biz, or to our speakers, Ed Suarez at Gunster and Holly Griffin at Gunster. Their email addresses are here on this slide. So with that being said, we're all set. Thank you, Ed and Holly, for presenting. We really appreciate it, and I look forward to the presentation. Here you are, Holly.
Good afternoon for those of you joining us on the East Coast. Good morning for those of you joining us towards the West. My name is Holly Griffin. I'm an attorney at Gunster. As Alex mentioned, we are a Florida-based law firm. We have offices all throughout the state, but we also do provide services to clients all across the country as well. Personally, Ed and I are both in our labor and employment group. I help companies with their day-to-day operations and employee management, providing advice and guidance and counseling on the issues that arise with employees on a day-to-day basis. I also assist in providing support for EEOC charges of discrimination, and I also litigate cases in the unfortunate event that you find yourself facing litigation. I am joined here today with Ed Suarez, who is one of my colleagues at Gunster. Ed?
Good morning or good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. First of all, thank you for the opportunity for having us here today. A little background before we get started about myself, just to kind of give you a little rundown. Like Holly, I'm in the Labor and Employment Division here at Gunster, been practicing for over 25 years. A little different than most labor and employment attorneys in that I started on the production floor and actually worked in business, having owned my own manufacturing facility. At one point in time, I was the interim VP of HR for an organization with 1,500 employees, and the interim VP of operations for an organization up in Connecticut. So while we go through this presentation today, one of the things that you're going to be hearing from us is not just the legal part of this discussion of this topic, but you're going to also hear the business side, the operational side, and as well as the behavioral side. One of the things I study is behavioral science. And so we're going to be looking at this from 3 different perspectives today. So we hope you enjoy it. We really would love to have your questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. The more questions we have, the more activity we get, we hope the better the presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Holly and we will get started.
Right. So I'm sure you're all aware that we are here today to discuss sexual harassment in the workplace. Our goal today will be that hopefully by the end of our seminar, Ed and I have shared with you some information that you as HR professionals and importantly your companies will need to know about things that are relating to issues in sexual harassment. Our goals today are to we're going to start by providing a general overview of some of the legal aspects of sexual harassment, the laws that govern sexual harassment. We also want to, as Ed said, talk about and understand the impact that sexual harassment has on your employees, the impact it's going to have on your organization, both from a business perspective and from the employee relations perspective, so that we can understand how to avoid claims and hopefully be proactive in order to prevent those claims from coming our way. And if we do any combination of, or even just a majority of these things today, I think that it's going to be a successful seminar.
So now we go to the next slide here, why you're here today. And you look at this slide, and I look at it with 25 years of experience, and I have to tell you, I'm very disappointed in this slide. If you look at the first bullet point, it shows you that there's a total of 91,503 charges filed with the EEOC at fiscal year 2016. 26,934 charges for sexual discrimination. That's approximately a third, 30%. Now, folks, I want you to think about this. Why should this be of great concern to us? If you look at the numbers of the number of charges that are filed, and we go back several years at the height of charges filed with the EEOC, the numbers haven't really changed. If we look at the number of charges on sexual discrimination, the percentage of 30%, that number really hasn't changed. And so we should be asking ourselves as HR professionals, as attorneys, as business owners, as people in the business community, why is that occurring? Why are we not seeing a change? And I want you to think about this as we go through the presentation, as we start to look at the subject matter in the three formats of both legal, behavior, and operations, because I think one of the things that we're going to notice, one of the things that we're going to see, one of the things I hope you're going to recognize is that if we continue to train, if we continue to educate our organizations, our employees within the organizations in the same manner, in the same format, 10 years from now, these numbers will continue to be the same. If what we're going to do is just to review the law and just to review the consequences that come with the law, these numbers don't change. If we begin to understand the behavior that is causing the harassment, the discrimination, so that we can then create the training to modify the behavior, then 10 years from now, we will see a change in these numbers. And I believe that sitting in the chair of HR, sitting in the chair of decision makers, by making these changes and making these modifications to the training, we can have a substantial impact on our organizations and on these numbers moving forward. And that's one of the things that we hope to accomplish in today's session.
So what is it, or why is it that we're here today to talk about sexual harassment? What does it mean for you? What does it mean for your organization? Ed and I have been working in the human resources industry for combined quite a long time, for many years now. And we understand the difficult position an HR director is in. You're responsible for managing the employees. You're responsible for the human aspect of that. Your management, they're going to be driven by the numbers. I don't think it comes as a surprise to anyone listening in today that your management is going to be governed by the numbers. So we know that one of the difficulties that we see, particularly with training and with HR directors, is that they have a difficult time in convincing management to give them the resources, the time and the money to be able to conduct different forms of training, including harassment training. So that's why Ed and I want to spend so much time today talking about the interplay between not just the legal aspect, but how it is that also impacts the business operations, because that is how you'll be able to convince your managers that it's important for us to conduct trainings. It's important for us in the industry to train our managers and our supervisors on how to avoid harassment situations. And the reason that this is important is because these sexual harassment claims do generally involve managers and supervisors, and importantly, they specifically and significantly affect productivity and company performance. And those are the two issues that are going to be important to your managers when you are pitching the idea of needing to conduct additional training or trying to discuss sexual harassment seminars with your management. And one of the things that is really key here is that if you're hearing something, it's already too late to fix it. The employees, by the time it gets to HR that there is a potential claim of sexual harassment, you've already lost money, you've already lost productivity, you're already declining in performance in that department. And so it's very important to be proactive, and it's important to understand the impact that sexual harassment has in every department and throughout the workplace. So what makes harassment illegal? There's going to be multiple different sources here. The first is one that we'll all be familiar with, federal law, Title VII, which we'll talk about in more detail in a minute. The states, your state is also going to have some sort of human rights law, civil rights law that's going to likely mirror those federal laws. They may have other protections as well, but your state law may have different requirements than federal law. And then importantly, and what some people overlook, is local and county ordinances. A lot of different counties are now also stepping up to pass human rights types of ordinances, which will offer greater protection than that's offered at the state level or the federal level.
One of the things that's really important when we talk about harassment is that there has to be a distinction made between harassment that is illegal because it deals with a protected class, like sexual harassment, and harassment which is just immoral and unethical, that is just poor management, treating people poorly. And one of the things that we have in our society today that you hear people say all the time is, you've created a hostile work environment. I'm being harassed at work. And really what they're telling you is not that I am illegally being harassed at work or that it is an illegal hostile work environment, which Holly will speak to in a moment. What really they're saying is, I don't like the way I'm being treated at work. I'm not being treated with respect. I am not being communicated with in the manner in which I feel I should be communicated. I'm not being treated the way I feel I should be treated. And so because I feel this, I feel that it's hostile, I feel I'm being harassed, and so I throw these words out in order to get somebody's attention. And so we have to be able to make that distinction, not that we owe that person any less vigor in our attack or our focus on the issue, but it takes on a different perspective. When you have harassment that is illegal, the law requires us to take certain steps where when we have harassment that is not illegal, but it's just a poor practice, an immoral and unethical act, it requires our action, but not quite at the same level. So I want to make sure that we're clear that we understand that we have two distinct types of harassment and that our focus today will be harassment that's illegal. The other thing that I want to share for those who are just starting in the practice of HR is that when the federal law creates a platform, it's a foundation, and state law can only add to that platform. It can't take away from the federal platform, it can only add. And so local ordinances can only add to the state platform. So, for example, on a wage and hour, and I use wage and hour as an example, it's easy to understand, federal law can create a minimum wage. State law cannot create a minimum wage, a state minimum wage less than federal, although it can add. So it can add to a federal. A state, a county can add to a state, but it can't make less than a state. A city can add a higher minimum wage than a county or a state or a federal. So that's how the laws play out here. So that's why you'll see that the federal law comes first, then the state, then the local and county ordinances. All of them are important, but the federal is the platform. It's the benchmark. It's the foundation.
So turning specifically to sexual harassment, there's two different forms of illegal sexual harassment: quid pro quo and hostile work environment. And we'll talk about each in turn a little bit separately here. What overarches them both, though, is that the issue is not the intent, it's how it's received. So although someone does not believe they are harassing a subordinate or a coworker, does not mean that sexual harassment hasn't occurred. It is entirely possible that an employee is going to perceive a situation differently. Today's seminar, we have people joining us from all over the country. There's going to be different cultural pockets and different customs depending on what state you live in, what area of the country, and even different areas of the state. Florida is one of those states where if you're in the northern end, it's completely different culture than if you're in the southern end. Every area, every pocket is going to have a different culture, a different custom. Just because an action is culturally based doesn't mean that it isn't going to be illegal. Something as innocuous as a hug, as a greeting, if it is perceived by the individual employee as being harassing, then that could be something that could create an issue from a sexual harassment perspective. So we need to remember here that it's harassment when the target considers it to be harassment, but that will be dictated in part by our cultural norms. As Ed stated, the federal law here, the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, is what starts as our base. And here is where it's obvious what Ed was saying earlier. He was talking about, we were talking about the numbers and how the number of sex discrimination claims has not really changed much in the last 10 years. And the thing of note here when we're looking at this is that Title VII was passed in 1964. That means that over the last 50 years, it's been in effect and we're still dealing with it. And what the numbers are staying fairly constant. The percent is staying fairly constant. So what this is telling me is that the message isn't getting across, or that the message itself needs to change, that we need to change our approach to the way that we are as human resources professionals dealing with sexual harassment, training, and prevention. So one of the most common things that most people think of, we're all familiar with the idea of quid pro quo harassment, something in exchange for something else. However, quid pro quo harassment is actually only makes up approximately 10% or so of the total claims of sexual harassment in the industry right now, or industry-wide right now. So it's actually not a very prevalent form of harassment, even though it tends to be the one that we all think of and we can all easily identify as being illegal. And that is unwelcome sexual conduct, either implicitly or explicitly made a term of employment, to which the submission or refusal is going to have some sort of impact on an employee's job. The bigger issue, and the one that's a little bit harder to get your hands around, is the idea of a hostile work environment. And the reason that the hostile work environment claims tend to be more prevalent is because they are the most confusing. As Ed was talking about a little bit earlier, the focus here from employees tend to be on the word hostile, as in how they feel. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's illegal, but from an employee relations standpoint, that does mean that there are going to be personality conflicts.
And what's really important here too is we have to be able to make that and understand that distinction. We have to be able to make that distinction between what is a personality base versus what truly is a violation of the law. So when we look at this, when we look at the definition where it says conduct that has the purpose or effect of interfering with an employee's work performance or that otherwise creates intimidating, hostile, or offensive working environment. When we look at that and we say, how do we define intimidating, hostile, or offensive? As Holly was indicating, individuals are going to have different definitions based upon their work experience. And so what one finds as intimidating or hostile or offensive, another individual may not find it in those manners or in those terms. So what's important is, again, to remind ourselves and to understand that how we see it isn't necessarily what's important or critical. It's how the person who is perceiving it sees it. That is the critical element within this formula, within this structure.
And part of that is, which goes, oh, we lost seem to have lost the PowerPoint here. It's coming back up here, but we'll keep. So one of the things here that ties into that, though, is that from a legal perspective, it must be both subjectively and objectively offensive. So what will count here is not just how we as HR professionals or how the alleged harasser views the situation. The subjective feelings of the individual who's being harassed are going to matter. I can't move on to the next slide, but we will continue. So what makes it a claim of sexual harassment? There we go. It is a claim that is based on a protected characterization, in this case, someone's sex. It has to be sufficiently severe or pervasive to alter the conditions of their employment and create an abusive environment. It must be unwelcome, and importantly, it will be evaluated by the totality of the circumstances.
So let's look at some of these terms here, and let's talk about them. If you look at the word severe and pervasive, and let's just take some realistic examples. We live here in Florida. I am from Tampa. Houses in West Palm Beach. We do a lot of work in Miami. I travel the country quite a bit with my work. There are words and there are things that you can do in Miami Beach. If you are there on a Saturday night, there are things that you're going to hear that most people won't even lift an eyebrow. You can walk at 8 o'clock at midnight in Miami Beach and hear things over and over again and be in awe, and people don't even flinch. You say those same words using the same tone, the same volume, the same content. And let's say you say it in Pennsylvania, in Amish country, and even the horse that's pulling the buggy will stop and look at you. Again, the definition of what is severe and pervasive changes based upon where you're at. That is one of the issues that we're having, and that's why, even though the law was passed in 1964, and we're 50 years plus into this law, it's a moving target. It continues to move. As society continues to change, this continues to be a moving target because things that were not acceptable 50 years ago have now become acceptable today. Let's go back and let's look at it from a social standpoint, from a behavioral standpoint. There are things that we used to watch on TV, for example, growing up, Leave It to Beaver, the I Love Lucy show, where you would see a husband and wife in two separate beds on a TV show. There were two separate beds in the bedroom. You now look at today's society, what you see on TV, and I can't even discuss it on the phone with you on the seminar. I would blush even though you can't even see me. Again, it changes. One of the things that I try to teach folks to show how things have changed is that today what we see on TV, even with regards to an individual's body, a male's buttocks on TV, It's something that we see not regularly, but it's not surprising to see it on TV. If you recall 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it became big news when that happened for the first time on NYPD with Caruso, the red-haired actor who's now on CSI Miami. It was a 1-second clip in the shower of that show that made national news. And over time, that was a kink in the armor that over time created a greater and greater gap and became more and more acceptable. Now, it's important to understand these concepts of societal change and behavioral change, because as we define the word severe and pervasive, you start to understand that that target that's moving is the reason why it's so difficult to put your arms and your arms around the subject matter of what is harassment, and why it's so difficult to teach and to understand this concept in order to change behavior in the workplace. The other terms of unwelcome is a much easier concept to understand. Defining the protected characteristics, for example, sex, is easier to understand. But that's the complexity of the subject matter that we're dealing with, and why 50 years later, after the law has been passed, we're still dealing with the subject matter.
There are some common things that you can look to that are pretty safe to say are prohibited conduct in the realm of sexual harassment, even with the moving target. These are the types of things that will most likely result in a situation that rises to the level of harassment, or could potentially one day rise to the level of harassment. And so trying to place prohibitions on them now is a good preventative step to avoid those potential claims. And these types of prohibited conduct, I don't think will come as any shock to anyone. Things like telling or emailing sexually explicit or demeaning jokes, using innuendo in the office, repeated requests for a date with someone who's not interested, insulting expressions like dear, doll, sweetheart, honey, broad, and darling. Speaking of things that were socially acceptable in the past but may have changed, some of those terms are certainly now considered to have negative connotations and could create a harassing environment. Inappropriate comments on dress or appearance, things that go beyond, oh, I liked your dress today. Discussions about sexual experiences, fantasies, thoughts, or dreams. Certainly that's going to create scenarios where someone in the vicinity is going to be made uncomfortable and is going to consider it unwelcome. Sexual gestures with hands or bodies, following or blocking someone's way when they're trying to walk away from you, displaying sexually explicit magazines, cartoons, or calendars in the office, and of course, massaging any part of someone's body.
One thing that I think is really important to understand is we have this misconception that sexual harassment has to do with sex. And really sexual harassment, all the studies have shown that the behavioral aspect of sexual harassment is not based in sex, it's based in power, it's based in control. And it has two parts of it. It really is one more of the harasser, lack of control and trying to get control or demonstrate power. That's the reason why that as we see more females in positions of power, we're starting to see more female on female harassment. We're already starting to see more female on male harassment. And we will continue to see that trend moving forward because, again, it's not an issue of sex. It's an issue of power and control. And so as the social dynamics change, we will also start seeing a change in the type of cases and fact patterns that we are seeing within the law. And that's something to be aware of. It's not just a matter of focusing on the males as the harassers, but looking at the circumstances that's creating the environment that allows the harassment to occur, whether it's male or female as the harasser.
Excellent introduction to our next segment. Let's talk about a few hypotheticals. Obviously, on a webinar, we won't be able to ask you to respond back to us, but we want you to think about the fact patterns as we're reading them and give thought to what you perceive to be the issues and, importantly, how you think you might handle it as an HR director. Martha, a female sales manager, encourages her female sales employees to wear sexually provocative clothing to close sales. Every morning, Martha requires her female sales employees to come into the office so that Martha can inspect their outfit and provide suggestions. Martha does not inspect any of the male employees. Alice prefers pantsuits and isn't comfortable wearing short skirts, low-cut shirts, and other provocative clothing as suggested by Martha. During these inspections, Martha comments on Alice's pantsuits, telling her she looks like a man, should show some skin, and should highlight her assets. On one morning, Martha even went so far as to pull on the hem of Alice's shirt to lower the neckline and telling her, "That's better." Is this sexual harassment? I hope that to each of you, this is obviously a situation where HR would need to intervene because of the potential that this situation could rise to the level of an unwelcome, hostile work environment. Obviously, by the description, Alice is not welcoming of Martha's comments on her outfits. But one of the important things to take away from this hypothetical and this discussion is exactly what Ed was just discussing. Harassment is not necessarily just male to female or female to male. You can have sexual harassment in circumstances when you're dealing with a female supervisor or female coworkers and a female employee. And sexual harassment doesn't have to relate specifically to comments about sex or specifically here we're talking about comments about necklines, we're talking about comments about clothes. Obviously those dynamics are going to relate back to a situation which is relating to Alice's sex.
Additionally, here's the other part of this too. From a performance standpoint, we're sending the wrong message. If I was Martha's manager, HR representative, I would be looking at Martha and I would be sitting her down and saying, "Martha, let's think about the message that you are sending to this organization regarding the ladies that work for you, the women that work for you. What you are in essence saying is that the only way that they can actually hit their performance goals is not by using their sales skills, and using their minds and their intelligence and their abilities, but you are now telling them that the only way that they can attain their goals is by using their sex appeal or using their physical being. And you're now telling them that the males are able to use their skill sets. So now what you're doing is you're sending that message, Martha, that the men are more intelligent, have higher skill levels and abilities than the females, because the only way the females can perform is by utilizing their sex appeal and their way of dressing in order to get the sale. Think about that message that we are sending if this fact pattern, in fact, is occurring in the workplace. So we have harassment and discrimination that's occurring in this fact pattern, both on the male side and the female side. So this fact pattern has multiple issues in it. Even though it's obvious only one issue stands out, there's a lot of underlying issues here beyond the obvious. And again, this has huge operational performance issues involved. Multiple ways of dealing with just one issue, hypothetical.
try another. Adam, Bob, Carl, and Debbie all share space in the same office. Every Monday, Adam spends almost an hour talking to Bob and Carl about his weekend dates. Almost always, the conversation turns sexual, with Bob and Carl making jokes and teasing Adam with innuendo. Debbie can hear the conversations, and it makes her uncomfortable. She has tried changing the subject, but Adam, Bob, and Carl just don't get the hint. Is this a hostile work environment? And again, hopefully the answer to us all is that it can be. Debbie has made her displeasure with these conversations known. She doesn't want to be involved in this type of innuendo and discussion, and she tries to change the subject but fails. One of the important things that we need to be aware of in office environments, and especially shared office environments, is that conversations can be overheard. Obviously, Adam, Bob, and Carl don't have a problem with the conversation or its content. They don't have a problem discussing the sexual innuendo. They think it's funny. It's not unwelcome to them. But Debbie views it differently, and Debbie can overhear these conversations. She's tried to change the subject, and she could potentially end up sitting in someone's office, in an HR director's office, claiming that she's being sexually harassed in the workplace.
When you look at the subject, when you look at the hypothetical, one thing to really focus on is that she said she has tried changing the subject. And some may claim, and rightfully so, that her trying to change the subject based upon how she does that, how she tries to change it, is putting the organization on notice that she's uncomfortable. And so now the organization may be placed on notice that she's uncomfortable with the environment and that some action has to be taken. But I want to go one step on the performance side of this. This type of situation I have seen many, many times in operations divide a group. Because when employees start feeling uncomfortable, it starts to divide the group and it starts to create exclusion. And so what happens is the workforce starts to bifurcate. The men, the women, this group versus that group. One of the things that we try to do in operations, as you all know, is to create teamwork. We need cohesiveness. We need people working together to create efficiency, to create an effectiveness, to work on procedures and methodology in order to deliver and to do it in a cost-effective manner. When individuals don't like working together or being around each other because they feel uncomfortable, because they don't know where the conversations are going, because they don't know who's going to be the target or who's going to be the focal point. They don't want, in those situations, they're not going to want to work in that team environment. And so a lot of times you'll have that employee that people say, well, Ed's not a team player, or Holly never wants to be a part of the group. And we should be asking ourselves, why? Is it that individually, internally, Holly and Ed don't want to be team players? Or has something within the organization, within the culture of the organization, driven that behavior in Holly and Ed not wanting to be a part of the team? Again, things happen over time, and our job is to hit the rewind button and try to track what occurred and what triggered the long-term effect that we're seeing today that's creating the operational ineffectiveness, both the legal side and the operational side.
This is a big part of why preventative training is so important, because Adam, Bob, and Carl are perfectly fine. They are team players. They get along great. And Debbie's the one who's being potentially excluded here. So everyone needs to be aware of these types of interactions and the impact they can have in the workplace. Our final hypothetical for you. Sarah works as a salesperson in a department store. One day, Sarah reports to her manager that a male customer has been following her around the store, asking her whether she has a boyfriend, complimenting her looks, inviting her on dates, and has tried to hug her. Her manager, Mark, speaks with the customer. Sarah overhears some of the conversation as Mark explains that the company values the customer's business and asks the customer to please work with another salesperson for service. The customer continues to come in to the store and follows Sarah, and one day she catches the customer trying to film her. Is this a hostile work environment? Now, this is actually from a real case. It was a case against Costco, and I can tell you that a jury thought that this was a hostile work environment to the tune of $250,000. It was a jury verdict in favor of the plaintiff because a customer had been harassing her on the premises. What's important here for us all to understand is that if you are in a business that interacts with other people, which you most likely are, your employees are going to be working with vendors, they're going to be working with guests, they'll be working with clients or customers. It is also your job to protect your employees from unwelcome harassment from anyone, including those groups, even though those people aren't necessarily under your direct control. It is your job to make sure that your employees are safe from harassment, even if it's from one of your big customers or your big clients. And that can put the company into a little bit of a uncomfortable situation. But again, this is why it's important to train our employees so that they know how to handle these situations, and so that our supervisors know when it's time to bring something to the attention of HR and how to handle potential incidents of harassment.
And that's also why it's very important that when we have customers, whether we are open to the public or whether we are a private company with, limited customers, because we're not a public entity where the public comes in to buy, like a Costco or a Walmart or so forth, that people understand how we treat our employees, that we are very straightforward with people, and when we do our tour, or we take our customers on our tours, that we talk about our core values, that we talk about our beliefs about our employees, that our employees are key to our success, that they're our family, that we respect our employees. They have to hear it from us, because if they hear it from us, they will start to emulate that behavior. They will understand that if we respect our employees, we expect them to respect our employees, which is critical. If you go to the next slide with regard to this whole issue of harassment, it's what I call the real world standard. And it's what I try to teach to all of our clients. And when I do my public speaking around the country, it's what I try to leave and drop to the participants. And that's the following. We can talk about the law, we can talk about the legalese, we can talk about behaviors, we can talk about cases, we can talk about consequences, we can talk about dollars. But at the end of the day, all of us have parents, all of us have siblings, all of us have loved ones, all of us have friends, all of us have somebody in our lives that we care about. And I always ask this question: when I want my spouse, my child, or parent to experience or be exposed to this kind of conduct? Because if I wouldn't want them exposed to this kind of conduct, then I have a moral and ethical and legal obligation to put a stop to it. Because if I don't put a stop to it today, if I'm unwilling to do that at my work site, knowing that it's happening, but I expect somebody to do it at my spouse's work site, at my child's work site, at my parents' work site, then that makes me a hypocrite. Because that means that I want somebody to do something for me that I'm unwilling to do for somebody else. And I'll tell you this: all of us in our lives have somebody that we truly, truly love and respect and never want to let down. When I used to work as a prosecutor for the DA's office in Georgia, I got to witness this straight on with somebody who was so heinous. But I saw this person, when the grandmother walked in, I just saw this person collapse in front of the grandmother because he knew that he had disappointed his grandmother. And I realized all of us have somebody, even the worst of people. And to me, that person is my father, who's no longer here with me. He passed away 20 years ago. And I always tell people, if that person was here and was watching you as you conduct yourself as a supervisor, as a manager, in your position of power and authority, would they be proud of what they're hearing, of what they're seeing? Would they be proud of you? Because that's really important. Because in front of these people, most individuals would not conduct themselves in a manner that would raise to the level of harassment, of creating a hostile work environment. It just wouldn't. And so when you look at this real world standard of would I want my spouse, my child, or my parent to be exposed or to experience this type of behavior, and then would my father, in my example, would my father be proud of what I'm doing, what I'm saying, my involvement in the situation? Those two concepts together are very powerful in changing the behavior of individuals, which will change the behavior of those around me, which will assist in changing the culture, and in fact will change the numbers that we talked about earlier on. Because at the end of the day, what we're talking about is building a workplace that builds on respect. Because everybody deserves that in the workplace. Everybody deserves to be rewarded for what they contribute and what they accomplish. And that only can happen when they're able to focus on their job and do the work that they've been engaged to do without the other obstacles and barriers that get in the way when you have somebody who's harassing, who's discriminating, and who's bullying people in the workplace. And so until the behavior changes, the environment is not going to change. The last slide really says it all. Respect is earned by our actions, not by the words of the training, not by the poster on the wall, not by the banister that hangs on the ceiling. It's by our actions. Our leadership drives it, we drive it, our employees drive it. That's the only way we're going to deal with this issue of discrimination, harassment in the workplace and actually have a positive impact. So we're going to open it up to any questions. If you want to type in any questions, we are more than open to answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, this is Alex again from HR Simple, and yes, like Ed said, feel free to type in any questions right now if you have any. If not, that's okay. I just wanted to say on behalf of everyone